I'm here in Mongolia on a McKay Photography Academy workshop. We're guided by our good friend Oso of Nomadic Tours Asia. The highlight of this trip is the Golden Eagle Festival. The whole trip is a perfect testing ground for the Sony a7r IV. It's a massive megapixel but sports and action capable camera. What's my opinion of it? And as an a7r III user, I'm interested to see if I recommend upgrading. Stay tuned for more. We started our workshop here in Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia. Mongolia is about the size of Alaska, 600,000 square miles, 3 million people, and over half of them live here in the capital city, which, well, it's been experiencing some growing pains. I think Sony has experienced some similar growing pains as they try to figure out how to give us a compact full-frame mirrorless that still feels great to hold. Well, they've made some really nice improvements to the grip in this fourth model. It's much deeper, more robust feeling, and I think people with larger hands or when you put on a longer lens are going to really like how it feels. We also have a locking exposure compensation dial. That's excellent. We've got a raised rear dial. That's mostly cosmetic. And we have buttons that are all in the same place but have been slightly redesigned and, you know, are better. I enjoy these. And although we don't have any additional buttons, we have some really nice additional customizability, both through the graphical interface that it uses to show you which buttons you're working with, and additional pages of features and functions that you can assign to these buttons. Over here on the left-hand side, we've got our ports underneath these little rubber hinged doors that feel much more robust than earlier models. And we've got the second generation USB-C, which should help with faster transfers and more reliable tethering as well. On the other side, speaking of faster transfers, we now have 2 UHS Type 2 card slots as opposed to previous models that had 1 fast card slot and 1 of the older, slower card slots. So those are all good improvements. Up on top, we've got a higher resolution viewfinder, 5.7 million dots versus 3.7 in the a7r III. 2 million dot difference sounds like a lot. Honestly, I really struggle to see a difference in the viewfinders between these two cameras, even when carefully looking side by side. So that's all the good news, or mostly good news. Now let's get to the not as good news. This articulating LCD screen, same design as previous models, so you're limited to this angle here. And it is touch sensitive only for panning around in an image after you've zoomed in and setting your focus point, or newly, touch to track focusing. We'll talk more about that soon. But it's just not that really nice experience that you find in Canon or Olympus touchscreen operations. The menu is still all the same. You can't touch to do that. You can't swipe from one image to another, so you're pretty limited there. But overall, and the feel of this camera, definite great improvements. I'm excited to get out now and start shooting with it. So we're just over a week into our workshop. You might be able to tell. I got a little beard going on here. We are at day 2 of the Golden Eagle Festival here in the western part of the country. It's been a fantastic experience. This is a great place to talk about the updated autofocusing system of the a7r IV. But before we do that, let me tell you a little bit about this festival. So this is a tradition in Mongolia. These eagle hunters capture a young golden eagle, just old enough to survive out of the nest, too young to fly, train it to fly, train it to hunt for them, and then yearly they have this competition to see who has done the best job. Way up on the hill above us, their golden eagles are released as the owners call them down. It's fantastic. Over 120 golden eagles yesterday with their hunters, and being able to be here and experience that, being up on top of the mountain among all of them, was awesome. And it was just a fantastic testing ground for the updated autofocus. So I've been using this camera, as I said, on this workshop for just about a week now, and I can tell you that it is definitely improved. The a7r IV over the a7r III, both in that kind of real-time tracking and the IAF. It's not A9 yet, but it's very, very close. And it's easy to say that other than the A9 system, this is the fastest and most capable full-frame mirrorless focusing system on the market currently. The number of out-of-focus shots I have because of the camera are incredibly few for the number of shots that I've taken over the last couple of days. So really, really nice and impressive. Still suffers a little bit in the backlit situations. That IAF has trouble locking on, but in most other situations, normal conditions, that IAF is incredibly accurate and incredibly reliable, which just really makes it easy. I like this. All right, so we just wrapped up 2 days at the Golden Eagle Festival, and we're here at our Gur camp in Olgi, and it's just been an awesome workshop so far. The culture, the photography, but also the adventure part of it has been a lot of fun. We've been riding around in these little Russian minivans, crossing rivers, up and down bumpy roads. They just go wherever they want. It's a pretty awesome trip. Let's talk about the awesome amount of megapixels in the a7r IV. We're up to 61 now. That's a 30% increase over the a7r III. You know, but when you look at it graphically, it's not a huge amount, but there is certainly an increase. And landscape photographers looking to print huge images, or wildlife photographers or sports looking to crop and have a lot of room for that, this camera offers a really nice high resolution, and there's no real drawbacks to that resolution. ISO performance looks to me to be the same as in the a7r III in the test shots that I've done. You've got fantastic detail, and that dynamic range that Sony has been known for, class leading, is still right here. So overall, really, really nice. Now, one of the other things that they did increase is the buffer size to deal with the larger files. Shooting the golden eagles yesterday as they were flying down off that mountain, coming down and landing as they were dragging their fake prey along was impressive as well. I was shooting up to 10 seconds of continued bursts without filling the buffer. Now I am shooting on compressed RAW, not the very fastest cards, but pretty fast Lexar, and that was giving me really good performance. I never saw any slowdown. If you switch to crop mode, you can actually get up to 26 megapixels still and get about 20 seconds of continued shooting again on that compressed RAW before you're going to start to see a slowdown in the buffer. That's all the good news. The bad news is, like previous models, you are locked out of some features and functions while you're writing to the card. And despite the buffer being large, or maybe because the buffer is so large, sometimes that writing to the card can take a long time. You can still adjust shutter speed, aperture, ISO, you can continue to shoot all of that, but things like drive mode, that's the one that's most particularly frustrating to me. You are locked out of those changes and similar ones while it's writing to the card. When we're talking about resolution, we should also talk about pixel shift. We have an upgraded version of pixel shift in the Sony a7r IV. Now, with the a7r III, it shot 4 images, and then you combine them after the fact to create a higher detail image, no greater resolution. So same megapixels, but more detail in it. The a7R IV's upgrade gives us huge 240 megapixel files. It shoots 16 images to provide that. Sounds pretty fantastic. And you know, when I talked about the a7R III, I was kind of excited. I was like, this is cool, nice, beautiful detail. You can certainly see a difference. But the reality is, in owning that camera for a couple of years, I can count the number of times on one hand where I've looked at a scene and said, this is perfect for shooting pixel shift, it's gonna work for me and I'm gonna do it. I just haven't. And despite the fact that we get these nice 240 megapixel files, I think that very few of us are actually going to see a real use for that. Studio photographers, yes, but your subject and you have to be absolutely still, locked down on a sturdy tripod, no real movement of grass or leaves or water. And so for most of us landscape photographers, I think it's going to be of limited use, but still kind of neat, with that added pain point that it does not combine them in camera still. You have to do that after the fact. So just keep in mind, Sony has upped the buffer in this camera, but they haven't upped your hard drive space or the performance of Lightroom. And so these are things you need to think about and are drawbacks to this higher resolution camera. So keep that in mind. I certainly see a little bit more sluggish performance in Lightroom. We're back in Ulaanbaatar. We've wrapped up our Mongolia workshop. Once again, huge thanks to Oso of Nomadic Tours Asia for putting together a fantastic trip. Truly one of the best Mackay photography workshops that I've had the pleasure of instructing on. It's now a great time to kind of wrap up our pros and cons of the Sony a7R IV. Let's start talking about the ergonomics. Certainly improved. Nice evolutionary updates here. This grip feels much nicer in the hand. And now, I never really had an issue with my Sony a7R III, but after primarily shooting with this camera for the last couple of weeks, when I put my hands back on the a7R III, it's a little disappointing. That, coupled with the enhanced button design, the locking exposure dial, the 2 fast card slots, and a host of other little improvements really add up to a nicely improved ergonomic system. Now let's talk about resolution. 61 megapixels, that's a lot of resolution. And impressively, Sony has done it without hampering any kind of ISO performance. You still got fantastic dynamic range, great detail, and really, there's no in-camera disadvantages to shooting. They've upped the buffer as well. And so all good improvements. And you can shoot at 26 megapixels crop. That's impressive as well. And that gives you edge-to-edge autofocus coverage. Now let's talk about autofocus. Certainly an improvement. This was a great testing ground. We had the Golden Eagle Festival, the Golden Eagles flying off the mountaintop, plummeting at speeds over 100 miles an hour down to their targets, down to their owners. And this camera, for the most part, reliably kept up with very fast-moving subjects. For a 61 megapixel camera, having an autofocus system like this coupled with that, it's pretty impressive. And again, it's not a huge difference from the a7R III, but it is a noticeable difference. So all good improvements. I do want to mention that I said no in-camera disadvantages to that higher megapixel. Again, I just want to stress your post-processing needs and your storage needs are certainly going to change when you upgrade or purchase this camera. Now, that kind of leads us into the cons because, well, there are some drawbacks to this camera. Some of them have been plaguing Sony for a while. The first is that general Sony lag. Now, it is a very fast camera to use and to shoot with, but when you go to playback, and especially zoom into images or change some features and functions, there's just this little hesitation, this little bit of delay that has always kind of bothered me, and I don't see in other cameras at this price point. You know, I even hesitate to talk about the Sony menu system because, well, I feel like it's harped on often. And people always ask me on these workshops, is it as bad as people say? And I say, well, it's not great, but what you do is you set the camera up the way you need, all of these customizable buttons, and you'll rarely find yourself in that menu. But to be totally honest with you, a few minutes ago, Kaz and I were looking for a certain feature and function, and both of us being Sony shooters, it took us several minutes to find what we wanted. So yes, this menu system does need a redesign. And then we've got the buffer issue. I mentioned it earlier, and that is why the camera is writing to the card. You're locked out of some features and functions. That's a little bit annoying. And then I had one particular bug on this trip. and that is the EVF auto switching from the LCD back to the EVF wasn't working as I expected it to. I do have an aftermarket eye cup on it, but I've used that on the a7r III for years with no issues at all. I found myself taking it off, cleaning the sensor. It is very dusty here in Mongolia, so that could have played a part in it, but I was a little frustrated with that, and I ended up actually assigning a button to be able to switch them back and forth because that auto switch just wasn't working. Well, I'm being warmed by the sun, and now is a great time to move into a discussion of, do I recommend this camera, and should you upgrade from previous models? So I've been shooting with this camera now for a couple of weeks, and well, as a Sony a7r III user, will I be upgrading? Well, I'll start this discussion by saying rarely do I recommend that people upgrade from one body to the very next release. It's rare that there are such revolutionary changes that will have a significant impact on your photography. Now, I say that being a Sony a7r II user that did upgrade to the a7r III. There are several pain points solved by the a7r III, namely that much better battery life, the ergonomic improvements with that focus point joystick. Those were huge and really impacted the way I was able to shoot. With the a7r IV, yes, an all-around better camera, nice evolutionary updates, but I struggled to find any one specific or more than one specific feature that are going to significantly improve my photography. So at its current price point, I won't be upgrading, but I can happily recommend this as the best Sony camera current and the best camera at this price point in its class. It is fantastic, with just a few of those little drawbacks I mentioned in the cons. Now, related to this discussion though is if you're looking to get into the Sony system and you're on a budget, well, the Sony a7r III being sold at $1,000 less than this current price, that's a pretty tempting value. That leaves room in your budget for a nice lens, maybe the Tamron 28-75 or even a big chunk of that 24-105, which is excellent. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm going to let you decide, are the faster AF system in here, the higher resolution and those slight ergonomic tweaks enough for you to spend $1,000 over the current Sony a7r III? Or are you just one of those people that just needs the latest and greatest? This certainly has a lot to offer. That's been my review here from Mongolia. It's been a fantastic workshop. And remember, there are links right down below if you're going to be buying any of this gear. Your use of those links greatly helps what we do here at PhotoRec TV. And if you'd like to join us on a future workshop, there's links to that right down below as well. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe along with the little bell to be notified of future gear reviews, tips, tricks, and travel videos. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.